teleportation, time travel, and invisibility. The government discovered all three in a single experiment. It should have been a victory, but the experiment's side effects were so horrifying that the entire operation was shut down and never talked about again. Today, we are diving deep into the government's closet to pull out the skeletons of the Philadelphia experiment, which is often dubbed the most terrifying experiment conducted in America. In 1943, the government launched a top-secret project codenamed Operation Rainbow. Some believe that it was personally overseen by Albert Einstein himself. Others think that the project simply used Einstein's unified field theory, but everyone agrees that the mission of the project was to make a giant ship invisible. Why would the government want to do something like that? Well, for starters, this was at the height of the Second World War, when the German Navy had the upper hand in the Battle of the Atlantic. Their submarines, called U-boats, were conducting coordinated attacks and sinking Allied ships left and right. On top of that, American ships were being destroyed even in areas with no German presence. This confused the Allied forces for quite some time. But then they realized what was happening. Turns out, Germany had developed and deployed magnetic sea mines. These were deadly for the US because they were invisible and didn't need to be controlled. Whenever a ship passed over one of these mines, its magnetic field would trigger the mine and cause an explosion. To American generals, it seemed like the only way to get past these mines was to simply teleport to the other side. What started as a harmless comment or a joke became the basis of millions of dollars in research spending from the government to look into how to make it possible. After years of research and studying, they decided to put their theory to the test. In October of 1943, the USS Eldridge was fitted with electrical generators that would supposedly bend light around the ship to make it invisible. This was done at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, with crew members from other ships watching on as hundreds of small generators were attached to different parts of the ship. Then it was time to turn on the generators. The collective hum of multiple generators could be heard at quite a distance, and those nearby could see that something was happening, even though they couldn't understand it. Suddenly, the ship was covered by green fog with a faint glow, and within seconds, just as it appeared, the fog vanished, as did the sound of the generators. But the most surprising thing of all was that the entire ship had vanished too. Then, a few minutes later, the ship was back with the generators turned off. It was done. They had just successfully teleported a ship. The experiment was a success. Or so it seemed. Something was off. Everyone outside was cheering, yet the ship itself was eerily silent. So much so that it was concerning. A few men from the shipyard went on board to investigate the eerie silence, and they found the crew completely stunned. The crew were silent, as if they had seen something too scary to put into words. Some were said to have a 1,000-yard stare. It seemed like the experiment had taken a psychological toll. But all of the crew members were physically okay, except for one guy. He was on the upper deck when the ship vanished, but when it returned he was on a lower deck, as if he had phased through the floor. Even more terrifying was what had happened to his body. His hand was fused to the steel hull on a molecular level. It was like the ship was constructed around his hand. Details of the experiment were sent up the chain, and despite the psychological toll on the crew and the horrifying sight of the one guy fused with the ship, the experiment was deemed a success, and another one was scheduled. A few days later, on October 28, 1943, the USS Eldridge was once again prepared for the experiment. The generators were already attached and required little servicing. All that was left was flipping the switch. Once again, the generators hummed in unison, and a green-blue fog surrounded the ship, and once again, everything vanished. The fog, the ship, and the sound, all gone. But this time, something else happened. The ship appeared in the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia, roughly 200 miles away. But even more surprising was that it appeared 10 minutes earlier than it had vanished. So if the ship vanished at 9 a.m. in Philadelphia, it appeared at 8:50 a.m. in Virginia. In other words, the ship had not just teleported, but it had also traveled back in time. But before the guys at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard could enter the ship or ask the crew what the heck was happening, the Eldridge vanished once more. For those in Philadelphia, the ship was gone for 10 minutes, after which it appeared just as magically as it had vanished. But this time, the crew wasn't silent. Painful screams of agony filled the air. It sounded like every crew member was on fire. External staff rushed on board to see what happened, and nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to see. Many crew members were fused to parts of the ship. Some had their feet attached to the floor. Others had their arms fused to the side. One member had been turned inside out, a human-shaped pile of blood and bones. Pretty much everyone on board had third-degree burns. The luckiest seemed to be dead, as the ones who lived were tearing out their hair and screaming in agony. The survivors would eventually calm down, though they continued to be nauseous and disoriented. Many were declared clinically insane, and those who recovered refused to say anything about what happened. The Philadelphia experiment was a success and a failure. Success because a Cannon-class destroyer escort was teleported over 200 miles and rendered invisible for the duration of the experiment. And failure because, well, the whole thing with the people fusing with the ship and going insane. It is said that the experiment was shut down and never attempted again, and we don't know much more because the government hasn't declassified any documents related to the experiment. Now, some of you watching this video might question whether the experiment even happened. After all, trying to make a ship vanish sounds too strange to be true. But before you dismiss the story, remember that the government has researched invisibility cloaks as recently as 2012. It spent $22 billion on researching strange technologies, including invisibility, space tunnels, and UFOs. You might think that it all sounds like science fiction, but the government literally uses science fiction as the basis of its research. In a document titled Invisibility Cloaking, Theories and Experiments, you can see illustrations of the Invisible Woman from the Fantastic Four comics, alongside the cover of H.G. Wells' novel The Invisible Man. So keep in mind that the guys who can spend billions of dollars on research like this can definitely spend a pretty penny to make a ship invisible. And by the way, this is far from the only case where government-funded research sounds like science fiction. Fans of the Stargate franchise are familiar with wormholes. These are theoretical teleportation tunnels that help with space travel. A wormhole bends space so you can enter at one point and exit in an entirely different galaxy. This is such a crazy idea that none of us would believe that the serious people in our government would spend money to research it. Yet, one report revealed that the government had spent quite a bit of money to research space travel via wormholes. Another discussed the possibility of digging a tunnel to the center of the moon to use it as a cannon to shoot spaceships. And how are we going to dig these tunnels? One of the suggestions made in the report was to use nukes. All of this is official, by the way. The government owns up to it. So if the government can fund research into wormholes, invisibility cloaks, and nuking the moon for space travel, it can definitely look at ways to make ships invisible. Especially during wartime, when the German Navy was a serious threat. So there is an explanation for why the government would want to conduct the Philadelphia experiment. What we need is an explanation for what actually happened. Even though we know why, where, and how the Philadelphia experiment happened, we still don't know what exactly happened. You know, the intricacies of it all. And because of the lack of this data, people have been left to come out with their own theory of what actually happened. The first one, which is very bizarre even for this channel, is the disintegration theory. This theory supports the idea that the ship disintegrated at an atomic level and reassembled after the generators were turned off. This would explain why one of the sailors was on a different floor when the ship reappeared. It would also explain how the ship traveled to Norfolk and returned, because individual atoms can travel long distances without being weighed down by gravity. More importantly, this theory explains why the crew suffered from serious psychological problems afterward. Who can blame them? They were shredded and reassembled back into existence. At least one part of this theory is backed by science. Electricity can indeed disintegrate stuff. Lightning can fracture rocks, and a simple electric pulse can disintegrate granite. But turning an entire ship to invisible dust seems far-fetched. That is, until you learn about electro-arc metal disintegration, which is a process in which an electric arc is used to vaporize metal. Of course, saying that the Navy did that to a giant ship and its entire crew is a little wild. But we're being wild in this section. We'll get realistic later. But even this theory has a lot of loose ends that make even believers of the Philadelphia experiment not believe this theory. Which brings us to our next theory, the wormhole theory. According to this theory, the ship remained intact, but the space around it turned into a tunnel of sorts, allowing it to move to a different location. In other words, the ship didn't become invisible, it just went to a different place. What supports this theory is that in the second iteration of the experiment, the ship was reportedly seen in Norfolk, Virginia. But the first time around, it just vanished and wasn't seen anywhere else. Believers of the wormhole theory believe that the ship teleported the first time around as well, but went to a place with no witnesses. Maybe it went to the middle of the ocean. Another thing that supports this theory is the testimony of Alfred Bielek. Bielek was the only survivor to speak about the experiment. He was on board the Eldridge and felt like the ship was traveling through space and time. That feels a lot more like going through a wormhole. He made so many bold claims about the secret experiment done by the government and how the experiment affected him terribly and kept on affecting him until his death. His testimony of the Philadelphia experiment made him part and parcel of the Philadelphia lore. Even though all these sound weird, it should be noted all these experiments are based on science, according to Einstein. Physicists want to understand Einstein's unified field theory and gravity, and be able to manipulate it to the same extent that we understand electricity and magnetism and can use them for our own purposes. We're hoping that if gravity, electricity, and magnetism are all various manifestations of the same thing, we can create a tool or device that uses one or both of the first two, electricity and magnetism, to generate the third. 20th century technology is what it is today because of the efforts of men like Ampere, Faraday, Maxwell, and Hertz. These 20th century scientists and mathematicians pioneered the theoretical and experimental work in electricity and magnetism that we now take for granted and use anyhow. Science expects that the fundamentals of gravitation will be thoroughly understood enough to give rise to technologies such as anti-gravity generators and propulsion devices. However, if Albert Einstein's relativity theory is right, whoever controls gravity also controls time, because the two are inextricably linked. The ramifications are both fantastic and terrifying. I personally love Brian Cox and Brian Greene's explanation of the wormhole theory, who by the way are physicists, and the way they explain it makes you see how possible it is. However, those who believe in the wormhole theory claim that it is the general public that hasn't seen a wormhole. The insiders, they believe, have witnessed and used wormholes. Some of them think that wormholes will soon be used for space travel, and all the sci-fi movies and even the space-related startups prove that we are being primed to accept interplanetary existence. And there are usually two reactions to this. Wow, that makes a lot of sense. And wow, you must be really high. Now, speaking of being high, we have the final theory, the hallucination theory. According to this theory, the unified field theory experiment was just a cover. The government wasn't researching invisibility. It was simply testing a strong airborne hallucinogen that it could weaponize against the Axis powers. The witnesses who saw the ship disappear in Philadelphia, as well as the ones who saw it appear in Norfolk, were simply hallucinating. The speculated hallucinogen in this case would make you see whatever you were expecting to see. So people who thought the ship was going to be invisible witnessed it disappear. During the war, we could use this hallucinogen to inflate our numbers in the minds of our enemies. This theory has plenty of plausible evidence. For starters, the US government has experimented on its own citizens, and it has used airborne material for one of these tests. In 1950, the government tested our readiness to deal with a bioweapon attack by attacking us with a bioweapon. That's like testing how bulletproof someone is by shooting them with a bullet. And the government kinda did that in Operation Sea Spray by spraying bacteria over the city of San Francisco for an entire week. That led to a bunch of medical complications. But hey, at least the government got to do its test. Then there was Project MK-Ultra, where the CIA gave drugs to a very unlucky selection of subjects. Many of them had terrifying hallucinations, while some of them were temporarily paralyzed from the drugs they were injected with. And that was 10 years after the Philadelphia experiment. So it's not very far-fetched to assume that the Navy was also researching ways to weaponize hallucinogens. Another thing that's consistent with this theory is the color of the fumes. What kind of electric generator produces green fumes? It really sounds like the fumes were a special gas released to affect the witnesses, who were the real subjects of the experiment. So that's three theories. First, the ship disintegrated and reassembled. Second, the ship teleported through a wormhole. And third, the ship stayed where it was, but the smoke got everyone high enough to hallucinate the whole thing. So, which is which? Now, first of all, when you really think about the theories proposed, they all have their counter. For example, the disintegration theory falls apart when you consider the odds of the entire ship reassembling in its previous shape. Some of the humans on board were deformed, supposedly, because the reassembly wasn't perfect. Yet, the entire ship was reassembled into a perfectly operational vessel. That's technically impossible. The bigger something is, the higher its odds are of having reassembly issues. If even one of the crew members was deformed upon reassembly, the entire ship should have been deformed as well. And that's if reassembly was even possible after complete disintegration. Currently, we don't have the technology to split things at the atomic level, and certainly not to reassemble them in their previous shape. Then there is the wormhole theory, which is a little more plausible because wormholes are consistent with Einstein's general theory of relativity. They can be described as tunnels in space-time that let you travel to different points in space and time. But the problem with using wormholes to explain the Philadelphia experiment is that it's too powerful a technology to be kept hidden. If the government really figured out how to create wormholes back in the 40s, we would be in an entirely different universe by now. You can say that the government is just keeping it all under wraps, but remember, even nukes couldn't be kept a secret. Countries were racing to develop the atomic bomb. The US beat everyone by being the first, but it wasn't the only country with nukes. Wormhole technology is far more powerful than nukes. How could we secretly develop it and keep it under wraps for 8 decades without other countries developing some version of the same tech? It's damn near impossible. The third theory is the hardest to debunk, because airborne hallucinogens do exist. And our government has a history of experimenting on its own people. The only flaw in this theory is that it lacks witnesses. If dozens of bystanders hallucinated a giant ship vanishing and reappearing, we would have multiple stories coming from multiple sources. Plus, what are the odds that even 5 people will hallucinate the same thing exactly as it happened? That's a big coincidence. But this doesn't answer our question quite yet, which is, did the Philadelphia experiment happen? Well, I'm going to let you answer that question with a good old origin story. Initially, the story of the Philadelphia experiment had only one witness, a man named Carlos Allende, who witnessed the test while working as a deckhand on a ship called the SS Andrew Furuseth. Initially, Allende kept the account to himself, like everyone else who was at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard that day. But then he found out that a man named Morris K. Jessup was looking into Albert Einstein's incomplete unified field theory. Jessup had a little bit of fame because he wrote a book titled The Case for the UFO in 1955. Allende wrote hundreds of letters to Jessup criticizing his work. The guy had the same energy as the YouTube comments section. He followed Jessup's work, but loved to bash him. And when he learned that Jessup was working on the unified field theory, he decided to break his silence on the USS Eldridge conspiracy and talked about the Philadelphia experiment. Allende's goal was to convince Jessup to give up his research on Einstein's unified field theory, as it was too dangerous to contain if they ever figured it out. Jessup, who had ignored hundreds of letters by then, decided to humor Allende and asked him for proof, which Allende could not provide. So Jessup moved on, and he didn't tell anyone about the Philadelphia experiment. So how did the word get out? Well, the U.S. Office of Naval Research got an anonymous package labeled Happy Easter. Inside, they found a copy of Jessup's book with handwritten comments from 3 different people, Mr. A, Mr. B, and Jimmy. Using 3 different colors of ink, these contributors presented a lot of information about covert technology, and at several points they had brought up the Philadelphia experiment. This was how the word got out. Agents of the Office of Naval Research seem to have believed the story presented by Mr. A, Mr. B, and Jimmy, so they privately printed copies of the modified manuscript with all the comments. These copies were circulated among their close friends, who also happened to be in the Office of Naval Research. Soon, the story of the Philadelphia experiment started spreading as more and more people discovered the information presented by Mr. A, Mr. B, and Jimmy. But there was a problem. Mr. A, Mr. B, and Jimmy were the same person. While the comments on the book were made in 3 different colors, they had the same handwriting, and when Jessup, the author of the original book, was asked to look at the copy with the comments, he confirmed that the handwriting matched the letters he had been receiving from Carlos Allende. So not only had Allende warned Jessup about the Philadelphia experiment, but he had also taken Jessup's book and added the story of the Philadelphia experiment to it. And then he went ahead and mailed the modified copy to the Office of Naval Research. So far, the only person talking about the Philadelphia experiment was Carlos Allende. I mean, 3 people had talked about it in the modified book, but all of them were Carlos Allende. But that's not even the craziest part. Turns out Carlos Allende never existed. It was a made-up persona all along. The real guy was Carl Allen, who had a history of mental illness and was described by his family as a creative and imaginative loner. This made the story of the Philadelphia experiment less trustworthy. On top of that, Carl Allen admitted to making the whole thing up. Then he took back his statement. Then he admitted to making it up. Then he took back his statement once more. He could not offer any evidence. So it was pretty obvious that the Philadelphia experiment was a product of Carl Allen's wild imagination. But that did not stop people from believing the story. USS Eldridge was a real ship with an active crew who were pestered with questions about the experiment. They kept denying that it happened and were accused of covering up for the government. Finally, in 1996, the Office of Naval Research released an official statement that put the rumors to rest. It read, "The ONR has never conducted any investigations on invisibility, either in 1943 or at any other time. In view of present scientific knowledge, ONR scientists do not believe that such an experiment could be possible, except in the realm of science fiction." In the same statement, the Office of Naval Research offered a possible explanation for why the Philadelphia experiment narrative took off. Turns out, the US Navy was indeed conducting research to make its ships invisible, but not to human eyes. The Navy wanted to make its ships invisible to magnetic mines. As mentioned earlier, the Germans had deployed magnetic sea mines that would get triggered upon detecting a ship's magnetic field, and the US Navy was researching a way to make its ship's magnetic field undetectable. And by the way, they found a way to do it. It's called degaussing, and it's a very common protective measure these days. The research was initially conducted at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Carl Allen, who was working on the SS Andrew Forsyth, might have heard about it and made up the rest, because the logs of the USS Eldridge placed it in the Bahamas on the day that the supposed experiment happened in Philadelphia. On top of that, no witnesses or survivors ever came forward. But what about Alfred Bielek, the guy who was on the ship during the experiment? The one who said that the ship was basically sailing through space? Well, Bielek wasn't even in Philadelphia at the time. The speech made him popular in the UFO circles, and it seems like that's all he wanted. He claimed to have his fingers in all sorts of secret projects, including the Montauk Project. And it's just very unlikely that any person would have that kind of access to begin with. So Alfred Bielek wasn't a survivor, he wasn't a crew member, and he was nowhere near the supposed site of the experiment. He wasn't even in the military at all. The people who were at the shipyard and on the ship dismissed Carl Allen's story. None of them were disfigured or diagnosed with mental health problems. No dead bodies surfaced. And if all of that's not enough to confirm that the Philadelphia experiment was a hoax, just think about how little sense it all makes. The government ran such a risky experiment on such a giant ship twice, and on top of that, chose to keep the crew on board both times. Also, the fact that we haven't weaponized teleportation or invisibility in 2025 proves that we never really discovered it in the 40s. That said, the invisibility cloak research is very real. The government did spend $22 billion looking into invisibility cloaks and UFOs. But there's an explanation for that as well. The senator responsible for that whole program was Harry Reid. And most of the research for the program was not done in-house. So the government didn't do the research. It hired a third party to do the research. And the third party was a company owned by Senator Harry Reid's friend, Robert Bigelow. The same Robert Bigelow who was a regular contributor to Senator Reid's re-election campaigns for quite some time. So it sounds like the senator did him a favor by giving him a $10 million research contract, or as I like to see it, a $10 million gift. But as the documents from the project proved, none of it is practical in the foreseeable future. So it doesn't seem like we're anywhere close to generating wormholes. Now, even though the Philadelphia experiment isn't real, the horrors at Plum Island are. It was because of things done at Plum Island that people believed the Philadelphia experiment was real. The horrors the government did there were nothing you've ever seen, and you should totally watch it to fully understand the lengths the government would go.